Hello again, I'm Stuart, and welcome to our third in a series of financial analysis through the use of ratios. In this session, we're going to be having a look at liquidity ratios, which ultimately help us understand an organization's liquidity. Now, if you're not familiar with financial statements and you do want to understand a little bit more before you start looking at this ratio analysis, then please have a reflection to the video in the link on the screen here. So when we're looking at liquidity ratios, we're ultimately trying to assess an organization or a company's ability to meet its short-term obligations. So can it pay, for example, its suppliers when all of those bills become due? Now we're going to do that by looking at four different ratios. We'll have a look at the current ratio, which is trying to do exactly that in terms of the liquidity. It's one of the simpler forms to say, well, can we we've got enough current assets to meet all of our current liabilities. We'll then have a look at a more stringent test, which is the quick ratio or the acid test, and then an even more stringent example, which is the cash ratio. And then the final ratio that we'll have a look at is the operating cash flow ratio. Now, one of the simplest forms of a liquidity test is that of the current ratio. And here we take our current assets divided by our current liabilities. Now, if we recall, current assets are assets which we think we can turn into cash or liquid form within the next year or operating cycle. And current liabilities are liabilities that we need to settle within the next year or operating cycle. So what we're really doing is saying, have I got enough current assets to discharge my current liabilities? So if we have a look at these numbers for Smart Retail, we can see in 2026, their current assets were 1,402,000 and their current liabilities are 787,000.6. So if we were to calculate the current ratio for them, that is 1.78 times. And that's a fair result. Is it a good result? Well, as with all of these, we need to look at historical trends and compare to the industry. But what it does mean is it's got more current assets than it needs to discharge in terms of current liabilities. So it's more than one, so therefore it's favorable. Now, also, if we then compare that to the previous year to see how has that changed or evolved, well, we can look as we divide those two numbers. The prior year, it was 1.6. So there's been a slight improvement in terms of that current ratio, and therefore it looks like the stability has improved a little bit. Now, another variant on this liquidity test is the quick ratio or the acid test. And this time we're going to look at those current assets that really are very liquid. So we're going to take inventory out of the equation. Now, the reason for that is with inventory, it's got that longer cycle time. We need to turn it into a product or a finished good. We need to sell it, collect those funds, and then we've got our liquid funds available. So by removing inventory, it makes the measure a little bit more stringent. So here, if we take our current assets less inventory for Smart Retail in 2026, we can see those current assets have now reduced to $408,000. Our current liabilities are still the same at $787,000. And what this means is we don't have enough liquid current assets, excluding inventory, to cover those current liabilities. Our ratio is 0.52. Now, is that a problem? Well, it could well be, but it really depends on the business cycle. And this is one of the things we've really got to understand with these liquidity ratios is it does depend on the type of inventory. And we'll have a look at that a little bit more shortly. But simply, if we compare that back to last year, 2025, we can see it has been an improvement from 0.32. So although it appears a little bit concerning that it's less than 1, it is an improvement on the previous year. Now, a third variant on these liquidity ratios, and probably the most stringent of, or definitely the most stringent of the three, is the cash ratio. And this time, what we're going to look at is, have we got enough cash to discharge our current liabilities? So we're going to take our cash divided by current liabilities. Now, if we have a look at this for Smart Retail for 2026, we can see their cash balance was $287,000 or 287.5. Divide that by the current liabilities, which were 787.6, then that gives us a cash ratio of 0.37. Now, again, ideally, in the one world and one mind of thinking, you'd say, have you got enough cash being held for this? But that can be incredibly inefficient, because it means that you've got cash sat in a bank that's not earning you any interest, so that you can allow to make those payments. So you often find that this is a lower digit that's in there. And once again, we do need to compare it to prior years and in industry standards. Now, if we look back at that prior year in 2025, then it was 0.16. So once again, we see through this year there has been an improvement in the liquidity of Smart Retail. Now, the fourth liquidity ratio we'll have a look at is the operating cash ratio. And this is looking at the ratios or the analysis or the liquidity analysis from a slightly different angle. And it's saying, are we generating enough operating cash, that first section of our cash flow statement, to cover all of our current liabilities? So what we're taking here is we take the operating cash flow from the cash flow statement divided by our current liabilities. And ideally, in a very simple world, they would have more operating cash flow than those current liabilities. But if we have a look here for Smart Retail, we will find that their operating cash flow was $580,000 and their current liabilities $787,000. So their operating cash flow is slightly less than their current liabilities, and therefore we see a ratio of 0.74. So what do all of these ratios mean? Well, as we've said before, really we've got to work on comparing these to previous periods, previous years, and maybe within the industry. Now, if we do have a look compared to the previous year, as we saw individually, Smart Retail has improved in terms of its liquidity within those ratios. We can see the current ratio, the quick ratio, and the cash ratio all improved reasonably markedly. And that signifies that they generated more cash through the year. Now we can also see the operating cash ratio. Whilst all of these are still less than 1, it was significantly better than what it was in the previous financial year. And that is also reflective of the fact that they generated more cash this year. Now, if we compare this to a electrical retail organization, Smart Retail probably is in a similar sort of ballpark. It can be quite difficult to find companies that just specifically look at electrical retail, but the ratios are often less than 1, because what's happening is that we buy equipment, we have longer accounts payable to pay the suppliers, and we're hoping that we're going to sell and turn that equipment over before we pay our suppliers. So therefore, our operating cycle is a little bit different. If we went to, say, a typical manufacturing organization, then you would expect that current ratio, quick ratio, and cash ratio all to be significantly larger. The current ratio might be 2.5 to 3, the quick ratio probably 1.5 to 2, and the cash ratio in that high digits in 0.7, 0.8, that sort of domain as it works through. So this is where we've got to be careful when you analyze these to understand the industry that you're comparing it against. So there you have it. There's 4 ratios that we can use to assess the liquidity of a company. As we've seen there, it is important to understand the industry, especially in this particular area, to understand their business cycle. And if you recall, we have seen that when we looked at those operating efficiency ratios in the previous video. Now, if you are interested in watching some more, there are going to be some additional videos within this series, so please look out for those. The next one, we will have a look at financial structure ratios. If you're interested in learning more about financial statement analysis, have a look at the online course which is included in the comments below. It will take you through some of the steps we've covered off here, the introduction to the financial statement analysis, and through that we'll give you also a summary of Smart Retail's financial statements so that you can work through those numbers and go through the calculations. It will also go through each of the steps, the operating performance, profitability, and bring through a real world example. So we'll have a look at the real company and see how this translates in the real world. And it will also be supported by short activities at the end of each section so that you can test your knowledge and make sure you've got a good thorough understanding. Now, each of these steps and that we'll work through on the course will be supported by short little videos like what you've seen in this particular video. And at the end, it will also come down to a summary section to summarize what does it all mean, how do we use it, and what other information do we need to consider.